The importance of time out. Erikson considered a society's ability to accommodate youthful identity crises as extremely important. He wrote about the concept of moratorium, a period of time or an experience that a culture deliberately creates so that young people can find themselves before embarking on proper adulthood. Today, we may take a gap year between finishing school and starting college. In Luther's time, a period in the monastery gave many young men an opportunity to decide what one is and is going to be. What would have happened if Luther had done what his father wanted and entered the legal profession? He may have done well in a conventional sense, but he may never have fulfilled his potential. Erikson remarked that the real crisis in a person's life often comes in their late 20s, when they realize they are overcommitted to some path they feel is not them, even if they entered it enthusiastically in the first place. Their very success has put them into a hole that may require all their psychological strength to climb out of. Erikson's broader point was that if at certain vital junctures people feel pressure to choose stagnation over growth, society at large suffers. All wise cultures acknowledge the youthful identity crisis and seek to accommodate it. Though troublesome in the short term, the new ideas and energies that are unleashed by these personal turning points can bring rejuvenation, not just to the person experiencing it, but to the wider community. Luther's final crisis. Even at the height of his fame and power, Luther was still writing to his father trying to defend and justify his actions. And, like his dad, in middle age and later he became something of a reactionary. The firebrand ended up living in comfort, defending Germany's system of princely government and urging peasants to accept their station in life. In outlook and habits he remained a provincial, rather than a worldly figure. He became just as his father wanted him to be, influential, well-off, and married. You would have thought this would have been the happiest time in Luther's life. In fact, it ushered in what Erikson called the mature adult crisis of generativity, in which people ask, has what I have created been worth it? Would I do it all over again? Or have I wasted all those years? Luther's first crisis was of pure identity. This one, Erikson noted, was of integrity. Despite being a great man, Luther still had to go through this phase, as every older adult inevitably does. Erikson's point was that the issue of identity is never completely solved. When one aspect of us achieves wholeness, there is still some larger self that is trying to make sense of our experience. Luther's life might be characterized as a succession of statements to himself of what he is not. That, in a way, is the easy half of identity formation. We are still left with the task of deciding who we are. Final comments. How we change our conception of ourselves over a lifetime is one of the most intriguing questions in psychology, because identity, who or what we know ourselves to be, or at least hope we are, is so fundamental. There is a tendency to belittle someone going through an identity crisis, to emphasize the normality of it. Yet Erikson's observation of Luther could be said of all of us in the same position. He acts as if mankind were starting all over with his own beginning as an individual. To him, history ends as well as starts with him. This may sound like the self-absorption of the adolescent, yet at all ages we must come to some kind of resolution about where we stand in relation to the world. Unless society does what it can to help with a successful passage through major life turning points, the cost will be not only mental illness, but also the loss of potential. The obvious danger of psychobiography is that we can read too much into a person's childhood and its effect on their later life. However, Erikson made a convincing connection between a severe childhood and domineering father on the one hand, and the tenor of the times in which Luther lived. He showed that Luther's personal crises could not be separated from the social changes happening around him, and that the whole Reformation could be seen as Luther's personal issues being worked out on a global scale. It was Luther's own conscience, for instance, that drove him to reposition the Church as secondary to a person's direct relationship with God. And as a true believer, his insistence on faith above good works also reshaped Christendom. Psychology matters, Erikson was saying, because history is essentially the acting out of individual psychologies. Erik Erikson. Born in Frankfurt in 1902, Erik was cared for by his mother alone until her marriage to Theodor Homburger, his pediatrician. The family moved to Karlsruhe in southern Germany, where Erik's 3 sisters were born. After school, he traveled around Europe for a year before enrolling in art school. He taught art for a while in Vienna, where he met his wife, Joan Serson, his lifelong collaborator. In 1927, he began studying psychoanalysis at the Vienna Psychoanalytic Institute, working under Anna Freud and specializing in child psychology. In 1933, Erik moved to the United States and changed his name to Erikson. He taught for 3 years at Harvard Medical School and also became Boston's first child analyst. At Harvard, he was strongly influenced by his friendships with anthropologists Ruth Benedict, Gregory Bateson, and Margaret Mead. He later had positions at Yale University, the Menninger Foundation, the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Palo Alto, California, and the Mount Zion Hospital in San Francisco. Erikson's well-known studies of the Lakota and Yurok Native American peoples were made while he was at the University of California at Berkeley. After leaving Berkeley, he worked in private practice for many years before returning to Harvard. Erikson's breakthrough work was Childhood and Society, 1950, a wide-ranging study of individuals and cultures that won the Pulitzer Prize and America's National Book Award. Other books include Identity, Youth and Crisis, 1968, Gandhi's Truth, 1970, and The Life Cycle Completed, 1985. Erikson died in 1994. Chapter 15. Hans Eysenck. The following are quotes from his 1947 book, Dimensions of Personality. Personality is determined to a large extent by a person's genes. He is what the accidental arrangement of his parents' genes produced, and while environment can do something to address the balance, its influence is severely limited. Personality is in the same boat as intelligence. For both, the genetic influence is overwhelmingly strong, and the role of environment in most cases is reduced to affecting slight changes, and perhaps a kind of cover-up. In a nutshell, all personalities can be measured according to 2 or 3 basic biologically determined dimensions. Books in a similar vein. Isabel Briggs Myers' Gifts Differing, Ivan Pavlov's Conditioned Reflexes, and Steven Pinker's The Blank Slate. Eysenck was one of the 20th century's most controversial and prolific psychologists. In a career spanning 5 decades, 50 books, and more than 900 journal articles, he shed new light on a number of areas. Born in Germany, his opposition to the Nazi Party during the 1930s led to his fleeing to Britain. At the time of his death in 1997, he was the most cited researcher in psychology. Dimensions of Personality was Eysenck's first book, and has a dry academic style. However, in grounding for the first time in science the concept of introversion and extroversion, it laid the foundation for 50 years' work in the field of personality difference. The 2 dimensions. Though Eysenck acknowledged the ancient Greek division of people into the 4 temperaments of sanguine, choleric, phlegmatic, and melancholy, and was obviously in debt to Carl Jung's distinction between introverts and extroverts, he was also adamant that any study of personality differences had to be objective and statistically based. Dimensions of Personality was grounded in a method of research, factor analysis, which enabled Eysenck to draw conclusions about personality differences from large amounts of survey data. He had worked at the Mill Hill Emergency Hospital in wartime London and used several hundred war-weary soldiers as his sample. The men were asked a battery of questions about their habitual reactions to certain situations, and they gave themselves ratings. The collated answers led Eysenck to confidently place a person according to two broad dimensions, or supertraits, of extraversion, introversion, and neuroticism. Eysenck believed that these supertraits were genetically determined and were manifested in our physiology, specifically the brain and nervous system. In this, he was inspired by Ivan Pavlov. The source of extraversion or introversion was in the varying levels of excitability of the brain. The driver of the neurotic dimension was an aspect of the nervous system that handled emotional responses to events. Later, Eysenck added another dimension, psychoticism. Though it could indicate mental instability, more commonly a person's placement within this dimension was an indicator of how much they were likely to be rebellious against the system or wild and reckless. Unlike the extraversion-introversion dimension, which measures sociability, psychoticism measures the extent to which someone is a socialized being living according to conventions, or, in the extreme, an antisocial psychotic or sociopath. Together, the three dimensions of psychoticism, extraversion, neuroticism became known as the PEN or PEN model. Characteristics included extraversion. The extrovert's brain is the opposite of what we would expect. It is less excitable than the introvert's. Because there is less going on inside, extroverts naturally seek outside stimulation and contact with others to really feel alive. Extroverts have a more even-handed approach to events, with less anguish about how they are personally perceived. And extroverts are also generally lively and optimistic, but can be restless risk-takers and unreliable. Introversion. The introvert's brain is more excitable, making them more vulnerable to moods and having intense inner feelings. As a result of this inner sensory overload, as a form of self-protection, they naturally avoid too much social interaction, which they find mentally taxing. Or, because they have such a rich inner life, they simply do not need a lot of social interaction. Because they seem to experience things more intensely, introverts have a deeper and more anguished response to life. They are generally more reserved and serious, pessimistic, and can have issues with self-esteem and guilt. Neuroticism. Neuroticism is an indicator of how upset, nervous, worried, anxious, or stressed we have a tendency to be. Scoring high on this dimension does not mean that people are neurotic, only that they have the sort of brain that predisposes them to neuroses. A low score indicates that they are more emotionally stable. The neurotically minded over-respond to stimuli, while those who are not are calmer and can put things into perspective. Neurotically minded introverts, in an effort to control the stimulation that comes into their minds, are susceptible to phobias and panic attacks. Neurotically minded extroverts tend to undervalue the impact of life events and may develop neuroses of denial or repression. Final comments. Though Eysenck's work on the biological basis of personality has been frequently criticized, it has also been increasingly validated by research. As Steven Pinker notes in The Blank Slate, studies of identical twins raised apart have demonstrated that only a small portion of personality is due to socialization. The rest is shaped by genetics. There are now many other models of personality type, including the commonly used 5-factor model of extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness, but Eysenck was the first to make the effort toward a statistical way of understanding the issue. It is unlikely that personality will ever be an exact science, but his work laid a foundation for better understanding of people that did not rely on merely social observation or folk wisdom. As both a serious scientist and a writer of popular psychology books, Eysenck contributed greatly to increased public understanding of psychological issues. In the 1950s, he made a celebrated attack on the scientific validity of psychoanalysis, stating that there was no evidence at all that it helped cure patients' neuroses, and in the process, he helped make psychotherapy more scientifically accountable and focused. Eysenck was also known as an intelligence researcher who, going against the ethos of social conditioning, maintained that intelligence levels were largely heritable and genetic. His 1971 book, Race, Intelligence, and Education, which laid out evidence of IQ differences according to racial type, led to demonstrations, and Eysenck's famously being punched in the face at a university lecture. He also delved into astrology, gave some support to paranormal phenomena, suggested that smoking-related cancer was linked to personality, and presented evidence that some people had a biological disposition to be criminals. Despite such controversies, toward the end of his life, the American Psychological Society made Eysenck a William James Fellow for a lifetime of distinguished contribution to psychological science. Hans Eysenck. Born in Germany in 1916, after his parents' divorce, Hans Jürgen Eysenck was brought up by his grandmother. As a young man, he opposed the Nazi regime and left Germany for good. He settled in England, completing his Ph.D. in psychology at the University of London in 1940. During the Second World War, he worked at Mill Hill Emergency Hospital as a psychiatrist, and from 1945 to 1950 was a psychologist at the Maudsley Hospital. He also established and became director of the psychology department at the University of London's Institute of Psychiatry, a post he held until 1983. Eysenck died in 1997. Chapter 16. Susan Forward. The following are quotes from her 1997 book, Emotional Blackmail. Though we may be skilled and successful in other parts of our lives, with these people we feel bewildered, powerless. They've got us wrapped around their little fingers. They swathe us in a comforting intimacy when they get what they want, but they frequently wind up threatening us in order to get their way, or burying us under a load of guilt and self-reproach when they don't. Perhaps worst of all, every time we capitulate to emotional blackmail, we lose contact with our integrity, the inner compass that helps us determine what our values and behavior should be. In a nutshell, we maintain our integrity only by withstanding other people's controlling behavior. Books in a similar vein. Nathaniel Branden's The Psychology of Self-Esteem. Anna Freud's The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense. John M. Gottman's The 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work. And Karen Horney's Our Inner Conflicts. If you have ever done something you did not want to do, but felt you had to in order to preserve a relationship, this book is for you. It is not until you read Susan Forward's best-selling Emotional Blackmail, when the people in your life use fear, obligation, and guilt to manipulate you, that you realize how pervasive emotional blackmail may be. The actual playing out of blackmail, while worrying on its own, is only indicative of deeper issues in both the blackmailer and the blackmailed. Why does one person feel that threat or intimidation is the only way to get what they want? Why do their victims allow themselves to be victimized? What is emotional blackmail? Most of us have had someone in our lives, be it a spouse, child, or workmate, whom we placate because we don't want to cause trouble in the relationship. Or we may be in constant open conflict with them because we resent the pressure to do something we know is not right for us. An emotional blackmailer can be summed up by the one basic threat of, if you do not do what I want you to, you will suffer. Because they know us well, they use their knowledge of our vulnerabilities to gain our compliance. In a normal relationship, there is a give-and-take balance in which we get what we want some of the time, the other person getting what they want at other times. However, the emotional blackmailer does not really care if we are happy as long as they get what they want. Blackmailers create a fog, F-O-G, of fear, obligation, and guilt, which makes it sometimes difficult to see how we are actually being treated. When fear and guilt are present, it often seems as if we are the problem, not the one who is trying to blackmail us. If a spouse or workmate or friend or relative does some of the following, Forward warns, we are a potential target of blackmail. Threaten to make things difficult if we don't go along with them, including ending the relationship. Imply that their misery is the result of our non-compliance. Make big promises if we agree to do something, which don't ever materialize. Ignore or discount our thoughts and feelings on something. Tell us we are bad in some way if we don't give in to them. And use money or affection as rewards to be given or withdrawn depending on whether we give them what they want. Often, the more we resist the blackmailer's demands, the more fog they pump into the relationship. We become confused and resentful about what is happening, but we don't seem to have the ability to act decisively. After all, is it us being unreasonable? Forward identifies 6 steps of emotional blackmail. 1. The blackmailer makes a demand. 2. The target resists. 3. The blackmailer exerts pressure. For example, I only want what's best for us. Or, don't you love me? 4. As the target continues to resist, the blackmailer makes threats. For example, if you can't commit to this, maybe we should start seeing other people. 5. Compliance. Not wanting to jeopardize the relationship, the target agrees to the demand. And 6. Repetition. The blackmailer has seen that the pattern works, so the groundwork is laid for future manipulation. The most important step is the last, for now the blackmailer knows that whatever they have done to get our compliance, it worked. They have discovered a pattern for manipulation, and we are the victim. Inside the mind of the blackmailer. Why is it so important to blackmailers that they get their way, even to the extent of punishing us if we don't acquiesce? In a chapter on the inner world of the blackmailer, Forward observes that they are usually frustrated individuals who feel they have to take drastic action in order to get the things they consider vital to them. Partners are amazed how hard their other half can suddenly become. The normal compromises of an intimate relationship are replaced by dogmatic decisions. People who cling or are angry or who continually test us are like this because this is the method they have adopted to protect themselves from possible loss. Though we are made to feel as if we are doing something wrong, it is more likely to be their past problems coming back to haunt the present relationship. By punishing us, blackmailers feel they are maintaining order or teaching us a lesson, and an inflexible stance makes them feel better about themselves. Yet, invariably, the punishment they mete out has unintended consequences and does not achieve their objective. Instead of being pulled into line, the target resents the whole situation and draws away. Much blackmail comes in the form of neediness or possessiveness. If we have to go away on business or decide to take a weekend course, the partner left at home makes us feel horribly guilty. They let us know how lonely and depressed they are when we are not there. Naturally, we empathize with them, but as Forward suggests, in time, our compassion only increases the manipulative behavior. To stay sane and healthy ourselves, we have to draw limits and recognize that what we want to do is quite normal, and that their demands are unreasonable, even if they apparently come from a loving place. There are many different styles of emotional blackmail. Some people issue aggressive threats. Others quietly let us know what will result if they don't get their way. Others give us the silent treatment until we find out what they want, and, in desperation to re-establish normal relations, give it to them. The closer the relationship, Forward writes, the more vulnerable we are to blackmailers. Not many of us would find it easy to stand our ground when being threatened with being cut off financially, with being divorced, or in the face of extreme anger or even physical abuse. On a more subtle level, one would find it easy to refuse a request when it is framed by the pleading question, "Don't you love me?" A daughter in the fragile stage of trying to wean herself off drugs knows she can get a loan from her mother to buy a house, because the threat is there. If you don't, I will go back to how I was. If nothing else, Forward asks us to remember that emotional blackmail sounds like it's all about you, and feels like it's all about you, but for the most part, it's not about you at all. Instead, it flows from and tries to stabilize some fairly insecure places inside the blackmailer. The effect of emotional blackmail. There is a difference between the familiar conflicts and arguments found in most relationships and a pattern of manipulation. While the former allows us to get into skirmishes and then go back to the basically firm emotional ground of the relationship, the latter involves the attempted or real diminishment of the other person's self. One person grows their power at the expense of another. Forward notes that even very strong disagreements don't have to involve insults or aspersions being cast on a person's character. Healthy conflict never involves trying to beat the other person up emotionally. Blackmailers always try to make out that their motives are superior to ours, and that there is something wrong with us. For example, that we're selfish or uncaring. They are skilled spin doctors, turning around their unreasonable demands so that they are obviously good for everyone. Whoever has a different opinion is mad or bad. Such twisting of reality corrodes relationships, sucking out all the fun, goodwill, and intimacy. What may be left is a shell, the trust and caring gone. The number of topics we can talk about lessens as the rift grows, and we develop a life of avoidance and walking on eggshells. What used to be a graceful dance of caring and closeness, Forward poetically puts it, becomes a masked ball in which the people involved are hiding more and more of their true selves. Every time we capitulate, we stop trusting our inner compass that normally tells us what to do to maintain our integrity. The more we become what the blackmailer wants us to be, the more we lose sight of who we are. Why we are vulnerable. Many people who come to Forward for help from blackmailers mentioned a feeling she calls the black hole. The thought of their partner leaving them was so horrible that they reverted to a very reactive mindset. They would do anything to keep them. We may function at a high level on the rest of our lives, Forward notes, only to turn to jelly at any rejection or perceived rejection from a partner. This fear of abandonment is the mother of most other fears, and all blackmailers need to do to achieve their aims is to start this rolling in us. But our integrity and peace of mind depend on confronting fears, and this is what Forward addresses in the second part of Emotional Blackmail. She provides tools and techniques for identifying our own emotional vulnerabilities so that we will never be held hostage by another person again. We learn how to stand our ground, confront the real issues, set limits, and be able to tell the blackmailer that what they are doing is not acceptable. Final comments. This is only a bare-bones treatment of emotional blackmail. The first part, understanding the blackmail transaction, is worth the price of the book alone, but it is in the second that an even greater value is to be found. Here, Forward goes beyond telling us what blackmail consists of and outlines how to combat and defeat it. One drawback of the book is there is no list of sources or bibliography. It would have been interesting to know Forward's influences, or whether her insights are all based on her therapy practice. Her ideas on the emotional makeup and history of the blackmailer echo the work of Karen Horney, who wrote about the neurotic tendencies we develop in childhood in order to feel more secure, but erroneously take into adulthood as well. Forward's books. She also wrote the marvelously titled Men Who Hate Women and the Women Who Love Them, have helped millions, and Emotional Blackmail is a perfect example of how a good self-help book can make a significant contribution to psychology. You finish reading it with a greater appreciation of the complexity of behavior and emotions that can be found within one person. Many of the people quoted in the book say that their partner can be both the most wonderful, caring person in the world, and a cold-hearted blackmailer, thinking only of themselves. The fact is, human nature can accommodate both. But we should never accept blackmail in our relationships because, even if they survive its stranglehold, the life is slowly squeezed out of them. Don't let this happen to yours. Susan Forward. Susan Forward's career in psychology began when she was a volunteer at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, Neuropsychiatric Institute. Enrolling as a graduate student, she gained her master's degree in psychiatric social work at UCLA and later her PhD. She has run a private therapy practice for many years, in addition to working with many Southern Californian psychiatric and medical institutions. Her first book, Betrayal of Innocence, 1978, made her an authority on child abuse, followed by Men Who Hate Women and the Women Who Love Them, 1986, and Toxic Parents, 1989, also a bestseller. Other books include Obsessive Love, Money Demons, and When Your Lover is a Liar. The latter and Emotional Blackmail were written with Donna Frazier. Forward is a well-known media and public speaker and has been a consulting witness at high-profile court trials. In her role as Nicole Simpson's therapist, she testified at the O.J. Simpson trial. Chapter 17. Viktor Frankl. The following are quotes from his 1969 book, The Will to Meaning. What I term the existential vacuum constitutes a challenge to psychiatry today. Ever more patients complain of a feeling of emptiness and meaninglessness, which seems to derive from two facts. Unlike an animal, man is not told by instincts what he must do, and unlike man in former times, he is no longer told by traditions what he should do. Often he does not even know what he basically wishes to do. Instead, he either wishes to do what other people do, conformism, or he does what other people wish him to do, totalitarianism. In a nutshell, the conscious acceptance of suffering or fate can be transformed into one of our greatest achievements. Books in a similar vein. Nathaniel Branden's The Psychology of Self-Esteem. Frankl's most famous work is Man's Search for Meaning, a gripping account of his time in a Nazi concentration camp and of fellow prisoners who either developed a survival mindset or gave up on life. Many readers treasure it as an antidote to the boredom and meaninglessness of modern life. While that book includes some explanation of Frankl's psychology of meaning, logotherapy, from the Greek logos or meaning, The Will to Meaning, Foundations and Applications of Logotherapy, is fully devoted to explaining its tenets and philosophical basis. This makes it a more challenging read, but a highly rewarding one. Frankl's brand of therapy is sometimes considered, after Freud's psychoanalysis and Adler's individual psychology, to be the third school of Viennese psychotherapy, and The Will to Meaning clearly points out the differences between his ideas and those of his compatriots. It also refutes the behaviorist school of psychology and its attempts to reduce human beings to complex products of their environment. Psychology's blind spot. What psychology failed to appreciate, Frankl believed, is the multidimensional nature of human beings. He did not deny that biology or conditioning shapes us, but he also insisted that there is room for free will, to choose to develop certain values or a particular course in life, or to retain our dignity in difficult situations. Frankl denied that things like love and conscience can be reduced to conditioned responses, or the result of biological programming. As a neurologist, he actually agreed that substantial aspects of the human can be compared to a computer. However, his point was that we cannot be boiled down to the workings of such a machine. We may have problems relating to the balance of chemicals in our body, or mental issues, such as agoraphobia, but we have another group of complaints, which he called noogenic, that relate to moral or spiritual conflicts. These cannot be treated by conventional psychiatrists, who may completely miss the point of why a person has come to see them. The patient may get more out of visiting a priest or a rabbi. Could the same profession that would have dismissed Joan of Arc as a schizophrenic, Frankl wondered, be trusted to make judgments on issues such as guilt, conscience, death, and dignity? Logotherapy's answer. Frankl considered his psychology to be existential, but unlike the existentialism of Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre, which is associated with the meaninglessness of life, logotherapy is basically optimistic. Its aim is to convince people that life always has meaning, even if it is not yet clear what that is. We may not discern a meaning in difficult or painful situations until later, when we have grown as a result of what happened. The greatest human achievement is not success, Frankl said, but facing an unchangeable fate with great courage. A dying woman whom Frankl attended to in hospital, petrified at what was to come, came to realize that her courage in death might be her finest hour. Instead of a meaningless early death, she found great meaning in the way she chose to die. Frankl argued that the existential vacuum that people feel is not a neurosis. It is, rather, something very human, signaling that our will to meaning is alive and well. He quoted the novelist Franz Werfel, "Thirst is the surest proof of the existence of water." Responsibility and guilt. Frankl once gave a talk in the notorious San Quentin prison. The prisoners loved him because he did not pretend they were all wonderful people or say they were victims of society or their genes. Instead, he recognized them as free and responsible people who had taken decisions that had led them to where they were. He acknowledged the reality of guilt. Frankl was fond of saying that a statue of responsibility should be erected on the west coast of America to complement the Statue of Liberty on the east. We live in an age of relativism, which waters down real values and meaning that exists independent of our judgments. But by choosing to be free of such universals, over time we paradoxically hem in our own freedoms. Conscience. If you have read Man's Search for Meaning, you may be surprised to discover that Frankl had an opportunity to avoid the concentration camps. While living in Vienna, because he was a neurologist, he was offered a visa to live in America. But it was only for him, not his parents. Knowing the fate that lay in store for them, he could not bring himself to leave. Each person, he wrote, comes into life with a unique set of potential meanings to fulfill. It is up to us whether we decide to grasp these meanings and accept them, or try to avoid them. There is no ultimate meaning of life, only individual meanings of the lives of individual people. To ask, what is the meaning of life, makes no sense unless we ask it of our own life and our own set of issues and challenges. This uniqueness of meaning is called conscience. Final comments. At the end of The Will to Meaning, Frankl asked the obvious question: if logotherapy is all about meaning, what distinguishes it from religion? His answer was that religion is, by nature, about salvation, whereas logotherapy is about mental health. Notwithstanding this distinction, a spiritual faith in ultimate meaning underlay his form of psychology, which instantly marked it as suspect in many people's eyes. Yet Frankl was a doctor of neurology and of psychiatry, and had survived 2 concentration camps. He was not a mystic or a dreamer. That human beings have a will to meaning cannot be denied, even if we doubt that life itself has some ultimate meaning. While Freud wrote of the drive toward pleasure or sex, and Adler of a drive toward power, Frankl believed that the human will to meaning was at least as strong a force in making us into who we are. While we are pushed by drives, we are pulled by meaning, and though he did not deny that biology or conditioning shaped us, he also insisted that there was room for free will, to choose to develop certain values or a particular course in life, or to retain our dignity in difficult situations. For Frankl, if psychology was to achieve anything, it had to take account of this will to meaning as much as it did the pleasure or power instinct. Viktor Frankl. Born in Vienna in 1905, Frankl studied medicine at the University of Vienna, where he received his MD and PhD. During the 1930s, he worked in the suicide department of the General Hospital in Vienna and built up a private psychiatry practice. From 1940 to 1942, he was head of neurology at the Rothschild Hospital. In 1942, Frankl, his parents, and his wife Tilly were sent to a concentration camp, initially Theresienstadt. The rest of the family did not survive, but Frankl was freed from Dachau in 1945 by the advancing U.S. Army. Returning to Vienna after the war, Frankl wrote Man's Search for Meaning, and was appointed to head the Vienna Neurological Polyclinic, a post he held until 1971. He received 29 honorary doctorates and was a visiting professor at Harvard and other U.S. universities, and at the University of Vienna Medical School. His other books include The Doctor and Soul, 1965, The Unheard Cry for Meaning, 1985, and The Unconscious God, 1985. Frankl died in 1997, in the same week as Mother Teresa and Princess Diana. Chapter 18. Anna Freud. The following are quotes from her 1936 book, The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense. In all these situations of conflict, the ego is seeking to repudiate a part of its own id. Thus, the institution which sets up the defense and the invading force which is warded off are always the same. The variable factors are the motives which impel the ego to resort to defensive measures. Ultimately, all such measures are designed to secure the ego and to save it from experiencing pain. My patient was an exceptionally pretty and charming girl and already played a part in her social circle, but in spite of this, she was tormented with a frantic jealousy of a sister who was still only a child. At puberty, the patient gave up all her former interests and was thenceforth actuated by a single desire, to win the admiration and love of the boys and men who were her friends. In a nutshell, we do just about anything to avoid pain and preserve a sense of self, and this compulsion often results in us creating psychological defenses. Books in a similar vein. Alfred Adler's Understanding Human Nature. Eric Burns' Games People Play. Sigmund Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams. Karen Horney's Our Inner Conflicts, and V.S. Ramachandran's Phantoms in the Brain. Anna Freud was the youngest of her father Sigmund's 6 children, and the only one to become a well-known psychologist in her own right. By the age of 14, she had read his books and was intent on following in his footsteps. And though inevitably tagged Daddy's Girl, in fact she was a pioneer in 2 important areas: ego psychology and child psychoanalysis. While Sigmund famously focused on the unconscious, the id, Anna made the ego seem more important, particularly in respect of therapy and psychoanalysis. Her work looked at how exactly the ego, id, and superego interacted, and it was through this understanding that she was able to explore the concept of psychological defense mechanisms. In her work with children and adolescents, she demonstrated to her father why they were quite different to adults in terms of psychoanalytical practice. The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense is her best-known work. Although it presumes that the reader has some familiarity with psychoanalytical terms, laypeople can still read the book, and it contains interesting case studies to spice up the theory. She used many classic Freudian terms, such as hatred of the mother, penis envy, and castration anxiety, which contemporary readers will take with a grain of salt. Yet behind these notions is a compelling explanation of why some people act as they do. And despite much debunking of Freudian psychology in recent years, Anna Freud's explanation of how defense mechanisms come about and their function is convincing. What is a defense mechanism? The term defense in relation to psychology was first used by Sigmund Freud in 1894. He meant it to describe, as Anna Freud said, the ego's struggle against painful or unendurable ideas or effects, which may lead to neurosis. the ego develops a defense in order to protect itself against being overcome by unconscious demands such as sex and aggression. The work of the psychoanalyst is to get the person to become conscious of their instinctual urges, which may involve isolating the pain experienced when they were originally confronted by an unsatisfied impulse. The ego is always alert to the dangers that the unconscious may overthrow it. It may try to intellectualize away unconscious urges, inhibit them, project them onto others, or deny them. Freud noted that when someone succeeds in creating defense mechanisms against anxiety and pain, their ego has won the battle between the three institutions of ego, id, and superego. When they have lost an internal battle to unconscious instinct or societal musts and shoulds, it is their ego that has lost. The ego continually endeavors to create harmony between itself, the unconscious, and the outside world. But this does not always lead to perfect mental health. In fact, sometimes when the ego wins, the person as a whole may have lost, since the win may involve the creation of a defense in order to have the ego maintain its sense of itself at all costs. Slave to the superego. While the ego is the normal thinking mind, and the id represents the unconscious, the superego in Freudian terminology is that part of us that responds to social or societal rules. When a natural instinct surfaces, the ego wants to have it satisfied, but the superego does not allow that. The ego submits to the higher superego, but is left with a problem. It begins a struggle with the impulse and, to reduce the pain of not satisfying it, engineers a defense that allows itself to make sense of its decision to submit. The superego, Freud wrote, is the mischief maker, which prevents the ego's coming to a friendly understanding with the instincts. It creates a high standard in which sex is seen as bad and aggression as antisocial. But renouncing the instincts may simply mean that the impulses are pushed out of the ego's view, and what the ego cannot incorporate into its sense of self is expressed elsewhere as unhealthy personality traits or neuroses. When the ego becomes merely an instrument for the execution of the superego's wishes, we get the bottled-up, prim and proper type of person, who lives in fear of being attacked and overcome by their instincts. Freud describes a woman whose life was shaped by her very strong superego, to the extent that her natural impulses, which she did not allow herself to fulfill, were projected into other areas of her life. As a child, she was a passionate wanter, demanding certain objects and clothing in order to be as good as or better than other children. Her desires were everything to her. As an adult, she became an unmarried and childless governess, dull in her outlook, not ambitious, and the wearer of rather plain clothing. What had happened? At some point, she felt she could attune herself to society's values and standards, and so repressed her natural wishes and went to the other extreme. In place of her own concerns, she spent her time empathizing with others and looking out for them. She was highly interested in the love lives of her friends and enjoyed talking about clothes, yet she did not allow herself these pleasures. Her defense mechanism against the perception that her desires were too strong was to gratify her desires through other people. Her ego and id had fully lost the battle with her superego, and this was the only way they could be expressed. Repression. While this example involved projecting instincts onto the world, Freud argued that this is a comparatively healthy form of defense. A more powerful and often more damaging defense is repression, because it requires the most energy to keep it in place. She told of a girl who, having grown up around brothers and resenting her mother's continual pregnancies, developed a hatred of her mother. Repressing these feelings because she felt they were not nice, her ego tried to protect itself against their returning by evolving the opposite reaction, over-tenderness for her mother and concern for her safety. The girl's envy and jealousy were transformed into unselfishness and thoughtfulness for others. Though this helped her fit into the family environment, her repression of natural feelings led to a loss of normal reactions and spirit in a girl her age. In another example, a young girl developed a fantasy of biting off her father's penis, but to avoid this feeling, her ego created a disinclination to bite altogether, which led to problems with eating. In both cases, although the ego was at peace in the sense that it no longer had to resolve an inner conflict, the girls suffered at another level when the conflict was repressed. Repression is the most dangerous form of defense, Freud observed, because it takes away consciousness of a whole area of our instinctual life, so deadening the personality. Children's defenses. Not all defenses are necessarily bad. They may simply be a person's way of coping with real external danger. When looking at defenses created by children, Freud noted that kids experience themselves as comparatively weak in a world of powerful adults and dangers, and as a result make up for this in fantasy and role-playing. Often, when a child feels threatened by an image, perhaps a ghost or a violent man, they incorporate the characteristics of this external object by pretending they are a ghost themselves, or by dressing up like a cowboy or a robber. They pass from a passive to an active role. In this way, they get back power from their environment. Freud analyzed children's stories in which a boy and a girl manages to tame a bad old man who is rich or powerful or fearsome, such as Little Lord Fauntleroy. The child touches the man's heart like no one else has been able to, and as a result he is transformed into a real human being. In other stories, wild animals are tamed, or beasts made human. What these fantasies commonly show is a reversal of reality. They may enable children to come to grips with the lack of power in a real relationship, such as between a son and his father, and they help children reconcile themselves to reality, paradoxically, because they allow them to deny it. The adolescent ego. Freud observed that teenagers often become antisocial and try to isolate themselves from other members of the family. Another feature of the adolescent is their changeable nature. At no other time in life do they so quickly and earnestly adopt new styles of clothing or hair, but also form intense attachment to particular political and religious ideals. At the same time, adolescents see themselves as the center of the world and are therefore narcissistic. They identify with things and people, as opposed to clearly seeing them and loving them for what they are. Freud noted that in every time of life in which there is a heightened sex drive, there is a danger of neurotic or psychotic disease if the ego is not able to process the urges properly. To the ego, increased instinctual drives mean danger, and in response, it does anything it can to reassert itself. This was her explanation for why adolescents are so self-centered. It is how they maintain their identity against a barrage of new and powerful feelings that seem to come from nowhere. Final comments. Freud admitted that describing the various defenses that emerge in response to anxieties and fears is not an exact science. How can it be when we are dealing with subterranean caverns of the mind, wishes and desires, and people's response to social pressure? Freudian psychology has been accused of being unscientific, and in many respects it is. Psychoanalysts have been replaced by psychotherapists and cognitive psychologists who are not really interested in a person's past or their longings. Their task is to fix erroneous ways of thinking that have led to unsatisfactory emotions or behavior. This is all well and good, but perhaps we will come to miss some aspects of Freudian psychology. Its sex and aggression take on humanity, its deep knowledge of dreams and mythological symbols, and its emphasis on the competing selves of ego, id, and superego. These concepts remain useful, and as for defense mechanisms, they are real enough that most of us can probably describe at least one of our own without trying too hard. The neurological reality of defense mechanisms has recently been noted, so maybe psychoanalysis has some scientific validity after all. Anna Freud's main contribution was in putting her father's theories into practice, and if Freudian psychology makes a comeback, her work is set to become more influential. Anna Freud. Born in 1895 in Vienna, Anna Freud had a close relationship with her father from the start. She was restless at school, a voracious reader, and from guests in the family home, she picked up several languages. Her older sister, Sophie, was considered the beauty, and Anna the brains of the family. Anna graduated from school in 1912, and after travels to Italy passed exams to be an elementary school teacher. Working on translations of her father's writings, she became a sort of apprentice to Sigmund, but also continued her teaching career. In 1918, she underwent psychoanalysis with her father, and in 1922 was accepted as a member of the International Psychoanalytic Congress. The following year, she began practicing as a psychoanalyst in Berlin, but Sigmund's jaw cancer brought her back to Vienna, and until his death in 1939, she was his primary carer. From 1927 to 1934, she headed the International Psychoanalytical Association and continued to develop her child analysis practice. In 1935, she became the director of the Vienna Psychoanalytical Training Institute, and from 1937 helped establish a nursery for poor children. When Austria was taken over by the Nazis, Anna organized for the Freuds to move to England. She established the Hampstead War Nursery for the children of single mothers, and in 1947, the Hampstead Child Therapy Clinic, a world center in child psychology. Anna never married and considered it her task to maintain and develop her father's legacy. She received several honorary doctorates from American universities, where she gave many lectures and seminars. After she died in 1982, her home in London became the Freud Museum. Chapter 19. Sigmund Freud. The following are quotes from his 1900 book, The Interpretation of Dreams. The dream never wastes its time on trifles. We do not allow a mere nothing to disturb our sleep. The apparently innocuous dreams turn out to be pretty bad when we take the trouble to interpret them. If I may be permitted the expression, the dream wasn't born yesterday. What animals dream of, I do not know. There is a proverb, mentioned to me by one of my students, which claims to know, for it asks the question, "What does a goose dream of?" and answers, "Corn." The entire theory that the dream is a wish fulfillment is contained in these two sentences. It concerns a set of dreams which have their basis in my longing to go to Rome. So I dream on one occasion that I am seeing the Tiber and the Ponte Sant'Angelo through a train window. Then the train starts moving, and it occurs to me that I have not even set foot in the city. The view I saw in the dream was copied from a familiar engraving which I had noticed briefly the previous day in the drawing room of one of my patients. Another time someone is leading me to a hill and showing me Rome, half veiled in mist, and still so far away that I wonder at the clarity of the view. The motif to see the promised land from afar is easy to recognize. In a nutshell, dreams reveal the desires of the unconscious mind and its great intelligence. Books in a similar vein. Alfred Adler's Understanding Human Nature. Anna Freud's The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense, and Carl Jung's The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. Not many people realize that Freud was a relatively slow starter. Although he was at the top of his class for most of his school life, he spent 8 years studying medicine and other subjects at university before graduating. He slowly entered the field of neurology, writing scientific papers on speech disorders, the effects of cocaine as an anesthetic, and child cerebral paralyses, before shifting his interests to psychopathology. But his ambition to be a renowned medical researcher came up against his desire to marry his fiancée, Martha Bernays, and to provide for a home he had to get work practicing medicine. The result was that the book that made his name, The Interpretation of Dreams, was not published until he was in his mid-40s, and even then it took over a decade for it to become famous. Only 600 copies were printed of the first edition of one of the most influential works in history, and those took 8 years to sell. Reviews and there were not many, were mostly unfavorable, and the first English translation, by A. Brill, was not released until 1913. The book provides a semi-autobiographical look into the bourgeois world of late 19th century Vienna, taking us behind the great man myth to reveal Freud enjoying time with his children, taking holidays in the Alps, dealing with his friends and colleagues, and seeking professional success. The main pleasure for the reader lies in the description and analysis of the dreams themselves, mostly those of patients, but including quite a few of his own, which can easily run to a dozen pages each, and draw on Freud's considerable learning in mythology, art, and literature. The interpretation of dreams brought a medical and scientific approach to a subject that had always defied real analysis, and in doing so, created a science of the unconscious mind. After finishing the book, Freud wrote, "Insight such as this falls to one's lot but once in a lifetime." It had taken him 40 years to fulfill his early promise, yet it was really just the beginning of his career. The causes of dreams. It is surprising how much had been written about dreams before Freud. He began his book with a lengthy survey of the literature, going as far back as Aristotle, and giving due credit to more contemporary figures, such as Louis-Alfred Maury, Carl Friedrich Burdach, Yves Delage, and Ludwig Strumpel. Summing up his reading, he noted, "In spite of being concerned with the subject over many thousands of years, scientific understanding of the dream has not got very far." From a conception of dreams as an inspiration from the divine, humans had arrived at a scientific view that they were simply the result of sensory excitation. While sleeping, for instance, we hear a noise outside, and that noise becomes woven into the dream in order to make sense of it. According to this explanation, common dreams such as finding ourselves naked are the result of our bedclothes falling off. Flying dreams are caused by the rise and falling of the lungs, and so on. But Freud felt that sensory stimuli did not explain all dreams. Physical stimuli, while we were asleep, could certainly shape what we dreamed about, but they could equally be ignored and not incorporated into our dreams. There was also the ethical or moral dimension to many dreams that did not suggest merely physical causes. Freud's interest in dreams originally came via his work with people with psychoses. He realized that the content of patients' dreams were a good indicator of their state of mental health, and that dreams were like other symptoms in being capable of interpretation. By the time he came to write The Interpretation of Dreams, Freud had clinically interpreted over 1,000 dreams. Among his conclusions were, dreams have a preference for using impressions from days just past, yet they also have access to early childhood memories. The method of memory selection in dreams is different to that of the waking mind. The unconscious mind generally does not focus on major events, but remembers the trivial or unnoticed. Despite their reputation as being random or absurd, in fact, dreams have a unifying motive that easily pulls disparate people, events, and sensations into one story. Dreams are always about the self. Dreams can have multiple layers of meaning, and a number of ideas can be condensed into a single image. Equally, ideas can be displaced. A familiar person can become someone else. A house takes on a different purpose, and so on. And finally, nearly all dreams are wish fulfillments. That is, they reveal a deep motivation or desire that wants to be fulfilled, often a wish going back to earliest childhood. While some writers believed that the memory of daily events was the prime cause of dreams, Freud came to the view that both physical sensations while asleep and memories of what happened during the day were, like a cheap material, always available and put to use whenever needed. They were, in short, not the cause of dreams, but simply elements used by the psyche in its creation of meaning. The disguised message. Having concluded that dreams were the arena in which the unconscious mind could express itself, and that they were primarily concocted to represent the fulfillment of a wish, Freud wondered why the wish was so poorly articulated, so wrapped up in strange symbols and images. Why the need to avoid the obvious? The answer could be found in the fact that many of our wishes are repressed, and may only have a chance of reaching our consciousness if they are somewhat disguised. A dream can seem like the opposite of what we wish for, because we may be defensive about or want to cover up many of our wishes, so the only way a dream can make an issue known is by raising it in its opposite sense. Freud explained this phenomenon of dream distortion by analogy. A political writer may criticize a ruler, but in doing so may endanger himself. The writer therefore has to fear the ruler's censorship, and so moderates and distorts the expression of his opinion. With dreams, if our psyche wants to give us a message, it may only be able to get it across by censoring it to make it more palatable, or by dressing it up as something else. The reason we so easily forget dreams, he believed, is that the conscious self wants to reduce the impact of the unconscious on its domain, the waking life. One of Freud's key points was that dreams are always self-centered. When other people appear in a dream, often they are merely symbols of ourselves, or symbolize what another person means to us. Freud believed that whenever a strange figure entered his dreamscape, the person undoubtedly represented some aspect of himself that could not be expressed in waking consciousness. He wondered about all the stories in history of someone being told to do something in a dream, perhaps given a wise urging that proved to be correct. Dreams can forcefully express an empowering message that someone is wont to suppress during waking consciousness, and that message is always about them, not family or society or any other social influence. All about sex. Freud's psychoanalysis of patients led him to the belief that neuroses evolved from repressed sexual desires, and that dreams were also expressions of these repressed feelings. It was in the interpretation of dreams that Freud first discussed Sophocles' play Oedipus the King, to support his idea of a universal tendency that a child is sexually attracted to one parent and wants to vanquish the other, what was later termed the Oedipus complex. Freud told of a significant event from his childhood. Before going to bed one night, he broke one of his parents' cardinal rules and wet himself in their bedroom. As part of a general rebuke, his father muttered, "Nothing will come of the boy." This remark must have hit him hard, Freud admitted, as references to the scene had been a recurring motif in his dreams into adulthood, usually in connection with his achievements. In one of these dreams, for instance, it was now Freud's father who urinated in front of him. It was as if, Freud said, he wanted to tell his father, "You see, something did become of me." This competitor for his mother's affections had now been put in his place, complete with the shameful image of illicit urination. In Freud's cosmology, civilization barely kept a lid on our instincts, and sex was the most powerful of these. Dreams were therefore much more than idle nighttime entertainments. In revealing our unconscious motivations, they were a key to understanding human nature. Final comments. Freud famously wrote that there were 3 great humiliations in human history: Galileo discovering that the earth was not the center of the universe, Darwin discovering that humans were not the center of creation, and Freud's own discovery that we were not as in charge of our own minds as we believed. This attack on the idea of human free will inevitably brought damnation, particularly in America, and as a result, the whole of psychoanalysis was painted as unscientific. Though Freud was an atheist, it was pointed out that psychoanalysis had taken on the aura of a religion, creating a whole new culture of the couch that Woody Allen satirized so well. Not only did Freudian therapy have too great a dependence on the psychoanalyst, there was a lack of standard procedures and verifiable outcomes, and little evidence of effectiveness in healing people. Neurology even discounted the idea that dreams could be linked to desire or motivation. In this climate, Freud was quietly bypassed on the reading lists of university psychology classes, and the number of professional psychoanalysts dwindled. By the early 1990s, Time magazine felt it appropriate to ask on its cover, "Is Freud dead?" Today, if you visit a psychologist or psychiatrist, you may not be asked about your dreams or your past at all. These are deemed irrelevant next to cognitive psychology's more precise methods of changing your mental state. Yet today's practitioners too easily forget their debt to Freud's original talking cure of listening to and analyzing the content of a patient's mind, and his insight that a person can simply be sabotaged by the irrational within. In addition, recent research at the Royal London School of Medicine has lent cautious support to Freud's ideas on dreams. Brain scan imaging shows that they are not simply the byproduct of random neuron firings. In fact, the limbic and paralimbic areas of the brain, which control the emotions, desires, and motivations, are very active during deep sleep. Dreams are, therefore, a higher mental function related to motivation, although the jury is out on whether this proves Freud's theory that they exist for wish fulfillment. Just after the 150th anniversary of his birth, can we be sure of saying anything definite about Freud's legacy? Though his discovery of the unconscious changed the intellectual and imaginative landscape, perhaps his greatest contribution was to make psychology fascinating to the average person. It was the possibility he gave of seeing into our own minds that made his ideas so compelling. Sigmund Freud. Born as Sigismund Freud in 1856 in Freiburg, Moravia, now known as Pribor, Czech Republic, Freud was the first of 5 children of parents Jacob and Amalia, who had come from western Ukraine. The family moved to Leipzig in 1859 and then Vienna a year later. Sigismund's parents recognized his intelligence from early on, giving him an education in the Latin and Greek classics and a separate room to study in. He was set to study law at the University of Vienna, but changed his mind at the last minute and enrolled in 1873 as a medical student. After graduating in 1881, he became engaged to Martha Bernays and worked at the Vienna General Hospital, specializing in cerebral anatomy. Later, he worked under J.M. Charcot at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, and with Austrian psychologist Joseph Breuer, with whom he wrote Studies on Hysteria, 1893. After the death of his father in 1896, Freud entered a period of deep reflection, study, and self-analysis, and began work on The Interpretation of Dreams. Within a few months of its publication, The Psychopathology of Everyday Life came out, which introduced the idea of verbal mistakes, Freudian slips, that reveal the unconscious mind. In 1902, the first meetings of the Wednesday Group of like-minded Jewish professional men were held, and Freud was made a professor of psychopathology at the University of Vienna. In 1905, he published 3 essays on the history of sexuality and Jokes and their relation to the unconscious. Psychoanalysis grew into an international movement with its first major meeting in 1908. In 1920, the Freud's second daughter, Sophie, pregnant with her 3rd child, died in a flu epidemic. Writings from this decade include Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1920, The Ego and the Id, 1923, An Autobiography, 1925, and The Future of an Illusion, 1927, which aimed to debunk religion. Freud's long essay, Civilization and Its Discontents, 1930, crystallized his ideas about human aggression and the death instinct. With Albert Einstein, he wrote Why War in 1933. After the Nazi regime's annexation of Austria in 1938 and its banning of psychoanalysis, Freud and family relocated to London. A lifelong heavy smoker of cigars, he died of cancer in 1939.